every villain needs a good excuse.
You complete me.
The Death Star was about bringing order. Thanos wanted to save the universe. Russia just wants to fight Nazis.
И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
Lots and lots of Nazis. So many Nazis, in fact, that they seem to pop up everywhere Russia has a foreign policy interest. Georgia, Nazis. Ukraine, teaming with them. The Baltic states, clearly harboring a new Reich. Convenient, right? Today, we're going to unpack one of the most persistent, cynical, and reality-warping lies in modern propaganda, Russia's Nazis in Ukraine narrative. It's lazy, it's loud, and it works on just enough people to be dangerous. The year is 2014. Ukrainians are protesting in the streets. They're sick of corruption. They're tired of the Kremlin's puppet, President Viktor Yanukovych, who just ghosted the EU deal and cozied up to Moscow.
Protests broke out after Ukraine's president rejected an economic deal with the European Union and drew his country closer to Russia.
The protest turns into a revolution.
What we saw here today was a revolution. For the second time in a decade, Ukraine has ousted its president, sending shockwaves from Washington to Moscow and dealing a massive blow to Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Yanukovych flees to Russia in the middle of the night with his golden toilets and mob ties. Ukrainians hit the streets. They demanded democracy, rule of law, and closer ties to the European Union. For Putin, this was a nightmare. A big, loud democratic revolution right next door. That's contagious, especially when your own people are looking around like, hey, why don't we get to vote for real? So Putin needed a story, a distraction, a way to make Ukraine's revolution look scary instead of inspiring. Enter the Nazi narrative.
Russia President Putin's campaign has been built in part on the claim that he's denazifying Ukraine.
Overnight, the Kremlin hits the gas on one of its most aggressive disinformation campaigns ever. Russian state TV starts blasting images of torchlight marches, cherry-picked clips of fringe nationalist groups, and scary voiceovers claiming that a fascist junta has taken over Kyiv. What's a junta? Most Russians watching don't know either. But it sounds scary, that's the point. They dusted off old Soviet vocabulary, slapped it on 21st century Ukraine, and ran it 24/7. It's not that Ukraine had zero far-right presence, it had some. But so does every European country. At the time, Ukraine's far-right parties, like Svoboda or Right Sector, barely scraped together a few seats in the parliament. In 2019, those same parties got exactly 0 seats, none. Meanwhile, in Russia, far-right ideology is practically sacred.
This is an attack in one of the city's underground walkways. The beating has been filmed by the skinheads to train and recruit new members.
So where were all the Nazis? Not in Kyiv, but don't tell Moscow, they'd already printed the t-shirts. Now, here's one observation. Before 2014, Russian state media didn't seem all that bothered by Ukrainian Nazis. In fact, they barely mentioned them at all. Before the Euromaidan, there were no breaking news alerts about fascist battalions in Kyiv. Zero hysteria. Why? At the time, Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych was pro-Russian. He played nice with the Kremlin, let Moscow keep its influence, and didn't make any sudden moves toward the EU or NATO. And as long as Ukraine stayed in Moscow's political orbit, it was miraculously Nazi-free. So remember, the Nazi panic didn't start because Ukraine got more fascist, it started because Ukraine got more independent. Here's the thing. In Russian culture, the word Nazi is loaded. World War II, or as Russians call it, the Great Patriotic War, is the national trauma, myth, and glory story all rolled into one. Beating the Nazis is the one thing Russia can universally feel good about.
Отечественная война завершена. Одержана победа, какой еще не знала история.
So, when the Kremlin says we're fighting Nazis again, it triggers a deep emotional reaction. People stop thinking and start feeling. It's clever, it's manipulative, it works. And once the label is on, anything goes. You can invade, you can bomb, you can commit war crimes because you're fighting Nazis. Who's going to argue with that? This isn't a new trick. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia and called its government fascist too. Whenever a neighbor defies Moscow, boom, they're Nazis now. If your neighbor plays loud music, you call the cops. If your neighbor tries joining NATO, Russia calls them Nazis and sends tanks. This is the part of the video where some guy in a YouTube comment section yells,
"But what about Azov?"
Yes, the Azov battalion started with some ultra-nationalist roots back in 2014. Yes, some members had sketchy tattoos. Yes, early photos were bad optics. But here's what Russian propaganda did. They took one far-right volunteer battalion, exaggerated its influence 1,000-fold, and turned it into the poster child of the Ukrainian military. In reality, Azov is a tiny part of Ukraine's National Guard, and over the years it got cleaned up, absorbed into state control and monitored. Compare that to Russia's infamous Russich group,
slicing off the ears of some of its victims to keep as trophies.
Я нацист. Я нацист. Я не буду углубляться. Националист, там, патриот, имперское направление и так далее. Я прям говорю, я нацист.
Or the Wagner Group, a private army of literal neo-Nazis and convicted murderers who were gifted medals by Putin himself before they tried to overthrow him. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Putin said the goal was to denazify the country. In practice, it meant bombing schools, hospitals, and residential buildings. It meant kidnapping thousands of Ukrainian children and shipping them to Russia. It meant executions in Bucha, filtration camps in Mariupol, and air raids in Odessa. It meant flattening cities with cruise missiles and then going on TV to say, "Don't worry, we're just here to fight Nazis." Let me translate. Denazification is Russia speak for turning your country into rubble and calling it peacekeeping. If you think this narrative stops at Ukraine, you haven't been paying attention. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltics have been removing Soviet-era monuments and reasserting their national histories, things that really annoy the Kremlin. So guess what? Russian media is now saying the Baltics are also flirting with fascism. Any former Soviet republic that doesn't want to be vassalized against is suddenly not so curious. It's copy-paste propaganda. The same phrases, the same threats, the same accusations. And if history repeats, we know what step comes next. Now, let's take a detour across the Atlantic at some point between 2016 and let's storm the Capitol dressed as Vikings. A chunk of the MAGA movement started parroting Russia's propaganda almost word for word. Ukraine, Nazi-infested. Zelensky, a CIA puppet. Russia, just misunderstood. It was like Tucker Carlson and RT were on a first-name basis. And the irony? Chef's kiss. These same folks who claimed to be bravely exposing Ukrainian fascism then turned around and began praising things like Elon Musk's Roman salute, as they call it. It appears when you start shouting Nazi at people fighting for their freedom, but then end up openly admiring authoritarian billionaires who cosplay as 1930s villains, it's less a moral stance and more a fanboy meltdown. And suddenly we're back where we started, in a world where the people calling everyone else Nazis are the ones acting the most like them.
Yeah, that's weird.
Russia is weaponizing shared trauma to justify modern conquest. We don't need a PhD in international relations to see what's happening. We just need eyes. And maybe a little less Russia Today headlines.